I just want to, first of all, encourage you to pray as we worship together that Miami beats New England. And also continue to pray that the Chiefs win then. So God is less concerned about that than anything else. So a few weeks ago, I started a message by saying we were going to study Revelation. And of course, we were only going to do the first 3 chapters, and in particular chapters 2 and 3. And I had many people tell me that they were quite excited because Revelation was one of their favorite books. I understand that. I like Revelation too. I like Revelation for one reason. It simply tells me God already knows what's going to happen even if I don't. And it certainly reassures me that in spite of the attempts of humanity to discredit Christianity and Jesus Christ, I know ultimately they are destined to fail. I know that not only because of the book of Revelation, I know it because I believe the Bible to be true, and I believe it therefore. And so one of the things I find interesting, I did this a number of years ago at Liberty. I took all of the predictions of the Messiah in the Christmas story and preached a series using those texts. This morning, I've entitled the message Christmas Prophecies. There are over 330 messianic prophecies in the Old Testament that Jesus fulfills. But what's interesting is when you are asked the question, why didn't the scribes and the Pharisees, when the Magi came to Jerusalem looking for Jesus, why didn't they know where Jesus was going to be born? Why is it they had to go search it out and then come back? Isn't this stuff they should have known? And I say, well, yes, that was what they prided themselves on, was their knowledge and understanding of the Old Testament. I also gave them an illustration to answer that question. I said, in our country, in our jurisprudence system, we have a saying that says, justice delayed is justice denied. Now, none of us actually believe that. The reason we don't believe it is because we ultimately are people who have hope that wrongs will be righted. Even if you're an unbeliever and don't care about Jesus Christ, people ultimately have a hope that the wrong will be righted. It's inherent in us to have a sense of hope. And I said, much in the same way, taking that saying from our legal system and civil law system here, I said, you apply it to theology and to the plan of God, and it's the same effect. If something doesn't happen when we think it should happen, we think it will never happen. And so I'm just going to take 4 prophecies this morning, Christmas prophecies, that center around the birth of Jesus and his years on earth. Simply take those 4 prophecies that are contained in the Christmas story this morning and take a look at them. Now, I'm only going to do it in picture form this morning. There are no words on the screen, so don't think that they're not punching the button trying to get something to come up. So this is going to require you to listen a little bit closer perhaps and follow along. But I just think that sometimes we divorce Christmas from the fact that Christmas is a historical fact. It's set in a place and in a time. It has geography to it. And it's interesting that God can take things worlds away from us, half a world away from us, and use them in ways that we would never think he uses them to accomplish his purposes. And he does it in the Old Testament with the birth of his son. Just to give you 2 bits of background, first of all, Matthew presents Jesus as the King of the Jews, and this morning we're going to look at Matthew chapter 2. Okay? But Matthew writes his gospel so that you understand that Jesus fulfills the promise that God made to Jacob in the book of Genesis. in particular in relation to the tribe of Judah, and in particular in relation to the clan of Boaz and David. In 2 Samuel 7, God promises David he will never lack an heir, a descendant, to set on his throne. And in fact, in 2 Samuel 7, God promises David that he will have an heir who will sit on his throne, and that kingdom will have no end, and that king's reign will never end. Jacob, in blessing his sons, when it comes to Judah, in typical Jewish culture, they would take their children and they would lay there, as the patriarch was nearing death, he would take his hand and lay it upon their head and give them a blessing. And here's what Jacob said to Judah: the scepter shall never depart from between your feet. Meaning, Judah and his tribe would have the king, the ruler, come through that lineage. And then you go on to 2 Samuel 7, and David is promised that, and guess what? David is born in the house of Bethlehem to his father Jesse, and they are of the tribe of, very good, you got that, Judah. Okay. So Matthew presents Jesus as the King of the Jews. In the Old Testament, there are prophecies beginning as early as Genesis chapter 3 about the coming Messiah. In Genesis 3, God says to Eve, "And your seed shall bruise his seed." The picture in Genesis 3 is that the descendant of Mary will crush the serpent's head. There is a cosmic battle from Genesis 3 that has been waging in human history. It's the battle between the kingdom of darkness, the kingdom of this world, and the kingdom of God. So when Matthew presents Jesus as the King of the Jews, he does it in the setting of Genesis 3. It's a battle between sin, Satan, and his rule, and Christ, the promised Messiah, and the only one who can vanquish and deal with sin. So in that sense, the motif of King of Jews in the Gospel of Matthew is really about who rules all of the universe and creation. That's the motif behind it. It's not that he's just the King of the Jews, ethnically speaking. He is the King of kings. He is the King of all kings. He is the God of all gods. In fact, he's the only king and the only God. That's Matthew's point. So now we're going to take a look at 4 prophecies real quick from Matthew chapter 2. The first one is rather quick, and you pass by it in a hurry. But it's right there in verse 1, and it says this: "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea," stop right there. He's born in the days of Herod the king, and that kind of gets you the historical geographical setting. There's a picture of Bethlehem today. Now, Bethlehem in Jesus' day didn't look anything like that, except that's the same location. Now, you'll notice if you look at that picture real close and your eyes are good enough and you're close enough or your glasses are strong enough, you'll notice there are tour buses sitting there on that highway. And that's close to the city square where the Church of the Nativity is. Back there where that little reddish thing in the center of the picture is, that's the city square of Bethlehem, and the Church of the Nativity is there. Now, I didn't take any picture of that simply because I want you to see the terrain of Bethlehem. It's rough. It's in the hills of Judea. That highway is a major connector highway, even to this day, that winds down that hillside between Syria and Egypt. So if you were going from Damascus down to Egypt, you'd come by trade route through the city of Bethlehem. We know where Jesus was born, but do we understand the significance of knowing where Jesus was born? So I'm going to tie it to the Old Testament prophecy of where Jesus is predicted and prophesied to be born. But I want you to know something and see something as we develop this. Keep in mind, that's the city. That's the place. You can go there. You can buy an airplane ticket and fly over there and get a tour and go right down there and look at Bethlehem. You can go into where they think Jesus was born, and it looks nothing like it did when he was born there. It is a gaudy representation of what Jesus is. It's got all kinds of incense burners and decorations and junk. I'm surprised all of Israel doesn't have a church built over it. Because any place you go to of any notoriety in Israel usually has a church built over it. Interestingly enough, the church that's built over the scene of the Nativity is both Orthodox, Protestant, and Catholic. 3 churches. They're all jammed together. All share a common roof, but you walk in the door, and if you go to the right or to the center or to the left, depends on where you're going to go to what church. More than you wanted to know. Micah chapter 5, verse 2 is where the prediction of Jesus' birth is stated. Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. But I want you to pay attention to something. It says that Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. If you go back over to Luke chapter 2, what is it that the shepherds hear the angels say about where Jesus is born? For to you today, in the city of David, in the city of David, before Bethlehem was called Bethlehem, it was named by the name used in Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah. Ephrathah is the old name for Bethlehem. That's the name that you will find the city used in the book of Genesis. Bethlehem is where Jacob buried the love of his life, Rachel. So literally speaking, the 12 tribes identify Bethlehem not only as the seat of their king, their famous King David, they identify with it in their mind and their heart as the starting place of the 12 tribes of Israel, of which Rachel is the mother of 2 of them. Okay? So when you read Micah 5:2 and it says, but as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah. You see, the line of Jesse is a small clan in the big tribe of Judah. So small is it that it doesn't get named in the genealogical records. And what we consider small and insignificant, God takes and uses for his own glory. Now, Micah 5:2 is set in the context of something. And it's interesting to read the context of Micah 5:2, because Micah is basically forecasting judgment upon Judea, and that there will be a king come who will overpower the king sitting on the throne in Jerusalem and carry off that king into captivity and carry off all of the temple goods and stop the worship in the temple. In verse 1 it says, muster yourselves in troops, daughters of troops. They have laid siege against us. With the rod they will smite the judge of Israel on the cheek. What Micah prophesies in verse 1 is the destruction of Jerusalem, and that the king will end. Jeremiah picks that up in the last few chapters of his book, Jeremiah, and describes the last known king in line from the tribe of Judah to sit on the throne being carried away into captivity. Micah predicts the downfall of the kingly line of David. But then in verse 2 he says, but, and you read it, and it says, as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be, if you read verse 2 carefully, it says ruler. In Israel. Now, most of us stop there with what we know about the prophecy of Micah 5:2. But if you read on in verse 2, what's it say about that person? His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. When God made the promise to David he'd have a king and heir set on a throne, and that kingdom and that king would never end, that means that not only would he succeed into the future eternally, but it also meant that he existed in the past eternally. And Micah 5:2 tells you that truth. You know, the great problem with Israel coming back after the Babylonian captivity was that the Babylonians had destroyed all the genealogical records in the temple, not only of Judah, but of all tribes. And that's why the oral transmission of history among the Jewish people is important. But ultimately, they can't prove by a written record what tribe they belong to. How are they going to solve that dilemma? There's a king who knows his lineage. And the interesting thing is that king shows up in the book of Revelation, and you know what he's got in his library? The record and name of every person who's ever lived. What becomes an insurmountable problem for proving his genealogy to people today has already been taken care of, because he first of all fulfills the prophecy of Micah 5:2 by being born in that town. And he's not your ordinary king. He's always been, always is, and always will be. He is the promise to Jacob of a scepter that would always be between the legs of the Lion of Judah. He is the promise of the seed that would crush the serpent's head and defeat sin. He is the promised king and ruler of everything there is, because he is the one who made it in the first place. Back to chapter 2 of Matthew, down in verse 6. The Magi come riding in. They go to Jerusalem, the capital of Judea at that time. Of course, you would expect the king to be born in the capital city, in the palace. That's why they go there. They come, they pose the question, where is he who's been born king of the Jews? Herod hears this, and he's troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And the reason all Jerusalem is troubled is because Herod has a history of being a bloodthirsty, cruel tyrant. Herod is not a Jew. He is an Idumean. He is an Edomite. He is a descendant of Esau, and he has no legitimate claim to be on the throne in Jerusalem. He's granted that by Caesar Augustus. To make it look more acceptable to the Jewish people, he marries the high priest's daughter. He's troubled. He doesn't like anybody challenging his right to rule. He's killed his own sons, 2 of them. He killed his mother. He eventually kills his brother-in-law and his wife and 2 more sons, just to protect his right to sit on the throne. So when it says he's troubled, that means he doesn't want anybody challenging his authority. Then he gathered together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, and he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born, and they said to him, now here's the amazing thing to me. Prophecy for me simply strengthens the foundation on which I believe. Prophecy for many people just is an interesting, trivial pursuit and never affects their life. Please notice what happens. They summoned the chief priests and the scribes of the people, and he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. He's not a Jew, so he doesn't know the Old Testament, so he gets people who does. And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And they literally quote from Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. Verse 7 says that Herod sent the Magi there to find them, because as he says to them, I want to come and worship him too. Why didn't he go with them to begin with? Because he's disinterested and he thinks that's a threat. And he's going to have somebody else do the footwork so he can come down and do something nasty in a little bit. And away they go. The first Christmas prophecy that Jesus is born in Bethlehem is fulfilled from Micah 5:2. The greatest king in Israel's history born in Bethlehem was David, until Jesus was born. And Bethlehem and David are simply a type of a greater king that was prophesied and promised and finally came. There's one thing to gain from knowing this bit of prophecy, where it's found and how it's fulfilled. And that is simply this. Number one, Jesus Christ is the promised king who is eternal. Secondly, God keeps his word. Write down to the city that the Son of God is born in. In other words, God pays attention to detail in ways we have no comprehension. By the way, the Micah prophecy was 700 years old when Jesus was born. Can you remember anything 700 years ago in human history? The second prophecy, the escape to Egypt. If it weren't bad enough that these two teenagers had to leave Nazareth and go to Bethlehem to be registered for taxation, have no place to have their baby child born, and then spend a year and a half or maybe a year there, the Magi arrive in Matthew chapter 2, and they find him in Bethlehem in a house, not in a stable, because time has passed. They've found a place to live. The Magi come in, prostrate themselves, and worship. How do we know they worship? Because of what they gave in their worship to Joseph, Mary, and baby Jesus. And all the gifts were given not to Joseph and Mary, they were given to the child. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These are expensive, valuable things. Why in the world would they give them to a baby born in a manger? Because he's the King of the Jews. Their job was to make kings. They are overjoyed. They are excited. But in verse 12, you find out that the Magi get a message from God by an angel. And they don't go back to Jerusalem and tell Herod where Jesus is born. Having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. Verse 13. Now when they'd gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Get up and take the child and mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night and left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. Why? Because a 700-year-old prophecy in the book of Hosea was going to be fulfilled. What was the prophecy? Out of Egypt have I called my son. Now what you need to know is that the 700-year-old prophecy in Hosea is a reference to another 700 years earlier and the deliverance of the children of Israel out of Egypt by another deliverer by the name of Moses. So the reference in Hosea 11:1 that is prophesied about Jesus being taken to Egypt is really a 1400-year-old prophecy that really finds its origins in the deliverance of the children of Israel from Egypt the first time by Moses. Now what you need to know about Hosea is this. Hosea is a story about spiritual adultery, about being unfaithful to God, and it is designed to communicate a story to the children of Israel, and Hosea is the tool that is used to demonstrate that. And Hosea marries Gomer, and she decides that she'd rather chase other men and becomes a prostitute. And God says, I want you to go buy her back out of the marketplace and bring her home and love her. And what Hosea does to his wife Gomer is exactly what God did to the children of Israel. Because they looked around the nations around them and decided that the other gods were better gods than the God who had delivered them. And so they fell into spiritual unfaithfulness. Now the interesting thing is that's true of all of humanity, right? Because spiritual adultery doesn't just begin with Abraham and the children of Israel. It goes all the way back to Genesis 3, and it affects all of humanity. And the great deliverance we need is the deliverance from sin and Satan. Again, the promise of a Messiah in Genesis chapter 3. The seed of the woman shall bruise the head of the serpent. Bruise means to step on and crush. So that when Matthew writes here in Matthew chapter 2 about the flight of Joseph and Mary and Jesus to Egypt, God is already setting up something he did 1,400 years earlier to Israel. He kept his word even though they were idolaters. And they lied about worshiping him only. And he brings them out of Egypt. And they're not out of Egypt but a few days, and they want to go back to where they were. They want to go right back to the sin they committed of idolatry. And 700 years after he delivers them the first time from Egypt, in Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1, God says, I'm still not going to break my word. I'm going to keep my word. And this time, my son is going to come out of Egypt, who will be the ultimate deliverer, the ultimate Moses, far better than Moses ever was. The statement in Hosea 11:1, my son shall come out of Egypt, was in reference to the history of Israel in the first Exodus. It's a historical statement about what God had done in delivering Israel out of Egypt. And here in the city of Bethlehem, God delivers another historical statement about Jesus, and it simply says this: just as I delivered Israel, my nation, my son, out of Egypt 1,400 years ago, my son is going to come out of Egypt as a deliverer to deliver people from what? Their sin. Their sin. The greatest cruelty inflicted upon humanity is not what one human being does to another, it's what Satan does to us. The greatest slavery there is the slavery of the human heart to sin and a false god or an idol. The escape to Egypt. 75 miles from Bethlehem to the border of Egypt. Another 100 miles into Egypt to get to the city of Alexandria, which 300 years earlier, Alexander the Great had established a city in Egypt as a place of refuge for the Jews. It's amazing how God works in human history, and we never notice it. But 300 years before Jesus is born, God has Alexander the Great, who doesn't care about God at all, establish a city in Egypt called Alexandria where the Jews could flee to, in a city of refuge. It's also the place where the Jews in the 400 silent years between Malachi and Matthew translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. It's called the Septuagint. As God brought Israel out of Egypt to be his nation and keep his promise, so God called his son out of Egypt to be his Messiah and redeem a people for himself. Again, the thing I learned from this prophecy more than anything else is what? God keeps his word. Third place, in the Matthew chapter 2, where the prophecy is concerned. Verse 16 of Matthew 2 simply says this: when Herod saw that he'd been tricked by the Magi, the word trick means mocked. It's a picture of kids playing. It's a childish act in which one child says to another, "Nana, nana, boo, boo." When he sees he's been tricked by the Magi, mocked by the Magi, and by the way, he doesn't know that they've been warned in a dream by God not to go back to it. They only did what God told them to do. That ticks people off if you haven't noticed. He became very enraged. The word enraged means to be like a volcano exploding. The word very in front of it intensifies it. And he sent and he slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he determined from the Magi. Why? I was asked a question just last week. Why didn't God stop them from killing the Magi? Here's your answer. Because that tragedy had already been repeated once before. And the previous tragedy in the book of Jeremiah is simply a picture of what was going to happen at the birth of Christ. That what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. If you want to read it, you go back to Jeremiah chapter 31. If you want the history and the background of it, here it is. Jeremiah is the weeping prophet, and he sees the demise and fall of the southern kingdom, Judea, which is made up of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. The Babylonians are the ones who come in and carry off the children of Judah and Benjamin into captivity. Out of that group are some notable people. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are teenagers when they're carried off. Without Daniel, you don't have the Magi riding up in Matthew chapter 2. 600 years before Jesus is born, God sends by captivity and refugee status into Babylon a young man by the name of Daniel who preserves the very group of people who ride into Jerusalem 600 years later and then to Bethlehem to crown the King of the Jews. If you believe in coincidence, you would just say it just happened that way. Okay? The history of Ramah here in Jeremiah 31 verse 15 is simply this. The first captivity of Jerusalem is taking place. Nebuchadnezzar surrounded the city and basically starved it to death. Cannibalism is occurring inside the city of Jerusalem. Parents are killing their children, or eating their children who've died from malnutrition and other people who've died from malnutrition. There is no fresh water inside the city of Jerusalem. They have to go down through Hezekiah's tunnel to get out the fresh water. Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians know exactly where that's at, and they've set up troops to kill people who go get fresh water there. It's in Ramah, which is 5 miles north of Jerusalem, where Nebuchadnezzar assembles all the captives at the city of Ramah, and he carries them off into captivity. That's found in Jeremiah chapter 40, verse 1. Ramah is the assembling place where all of Israel is carried off into captivity. And that's the background to what's described here in Jeremiah chapter 31. Thus says the Lord, a voice is heard in Ramah. And this is Ramah. There it is. That's Ramah. It's in the hill country, Judean hill country, north of Jerusalem. It's on the border between what was the northern kingdom called Israel and the southern kingdom called Judah. And the reason those two tribes separated was because of religious differences. Idolatry, basically. Okay? But Ramah sits on the border between Israel. Israel's already been carried off by the Assyrians into Nineveh. Much of the nation of Israel is already refugee status over in what is now Iraq and Iran. Judah's left. Nebuchadnezzar has come against Judah and Jerusalem and surrounded it. And he takes all the deportees and he brings them to Ramah, the hill country. Why? Because you can see that asphalted road there on the right side of the picture. To this day, there are people who hold a bike ride in Ramah across Israel. I'm from Iowa. If you've ever heard of RAGBRAI, if you're from Iowa, you know what that is. That is the Des Moines Register's annual event for riding from one side of Iowa to the other on bicycles. They still do that today in Ramah, commemorating, of all things, Nebuchadnezzar's vanquishing of Judah and the carrying off of the people into captivity back to Babylon. Right here from Jeremiah 31:15. It's a place, it's a city, it's a village, and it still lives in the national consciousness of the Jews of the world today. A voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. The last vestige of the nation of Israel is being deported into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar. Rachel had 2 sons. Joseph was her firstborn son. He had 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And those 2 sons were given half tribes, half a parcel of land. The interesting thing is that Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, by the time Jeremiah is living, are used to describe all of Israel. They're used to describe all of Israel. So when it says in verse 15 of Jeremiah 31 that Rachel is weeping for her children, it means not only the southern kingdom of Judah and Benjamin, but it means the northern tribes who are already gone. And the picture is of Rachel weeping because in Genesis 30 verse 1, she makes a plea to her husband and to God, give me children or I die, I perish off of the face of the earth. You know what is stated in the Palestinian Constitution? We will drive the Jewish nation into the sea, and they will be no more. Human history is filled with Satan's rage against God and trying to stop his plan. The first captivity by the Assyrians and the Babylonians was his attempt to take nations and kill off the Jews. And there's a picture of Rachel from Genesis 30 weeping because why? All of her descendants are being carried off into captivity. They're dying. And if you read the last line of verse 15, it says, because they are no more. The greatest fear is that this is the end of the Jewish nation and people. Why didn't God stop the massacre in Bethlehem of male children 2 years and younger? Because he didn't stop the massacre of Israelites 700 years earlier when the Assyrians came in and slaughtered people and carried them off. He didn't stop the massacre brought on by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. He didn't stop the massacre of Herod the Great of the babies in Bethlehem because he never stopped the massacre of human beings. Why? Because it's a reminder that the ultimate battle isn't against flesh and blood. It isn't me against you. It's against Satan and God. And which battle and which person is going to win the right to rule. And it's already been settled, folks. Now, just for an encouragement, you need to read verse 16, Jeremiah 31. Thus says the Lord, restrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for your work will be rewarded, declares the Lord. And they will return from the land of their enemy. Until 1948, Israel wasn't recognized as a nation. She established her independence and her own nationhood. And God's going to keep his word because he's kept his word. And Israel's going to come back to that place again. And at some point in human history in front of us, it will be the only government on the earth. Because God promised it. Rachel's weeping for her children in Jeremiah 31:15 prefigures, symbolizes the mothers weeping for their children in Bethlehem. In an attempt to wipe out the children of God and end the promised Messiah's hope of ever arriving on earth, Nebuchadnezzar and Sennacherib tried to obliterate the Jewish people. In an effort to attempt the plan of God from moving forward, Herod the Great went to Bethlehem and murdered males under the age of 2. And the list goes on, and they thought they'd accomplished it all when they crucified Jesus on the cross. What do I learn from this? One thing. God keeps his word. The final one, the return to Nazareth. Matthew chapter 2, verse 18. And here's what it says, and we go quickly. Verse 19. When Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up and take the child and his mother and go into the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee and came and lived in a city called Nazareth, to fulfill that which was spoken through the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. I challenge you to go into the Old Testament and find anywhere where it says that Jesus will be called a Nazarene. If you go to Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, you're taking the Hebrew word Nezer, which means root, not Nazareth, and misusing it. But suffice it to know this. Matthew says there's more than one prophet in the Old Testament who said that Jesus would come from the city of Nazareth, right? That's what it says right there in the last verse. They came and lived in a city. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets, plural. Now, lest you think that's not sufficient enough to trust, in the book of Jude, Jude quotes Enoch in a prophecy that's never found in the Old Testament, yet Enoch says it's a prophet sure and true. So just because you can't find it in the Old Testament so stated, trust Matthew's record that he's saying what God is saying, and that it's fulfilling a prophecy prophesied by more than one prophet in the Old Testament, that he'd come from the city of Nazareth. Now here's what you need to know about Nazareth. First of all, Archelaus was just like his father Herod, In a Passover shortly after Joseph and Mary had fled from Egypt, in a Passover feast at Jerusalem, some patriots tore down a golden eagle over the temple. Archelaus got mad and killed 3,000 Jews, slaughtered them. He's like his father. So when Joseph finds out on the return trip from Egypt that Archelaus is now governor of Judea, he says he's just like his dad, and I'm going to go on back to Nazareth. I'm just going to go home. And of course, God confirmed that choice, didn't he? God confirmed that choice. Here's what you need to know about Jesus going back to Nazareth. The term Nazarene was a term of derision in Jesus' lifetime. It was a term of derision. Why? Because the inhabitants of Nazareth during Jesus' day were considered rough and rude people. You remember what Nathanael said to Philip when he said that they'd found the Messiah and he was from the city of Nazareth? Nathanael said to Philip, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Fulfilled the prophecy in the Old Testament, he shall be called a Nazarene. From the most unsuspecting places, God uses people to accomplish his purposes. Even places that other people look down on. Even other people they look down on. And sure enough, 30 years later, the Nazarene begins his ministry. And when they call him Jesus of Nazareth, it's not an endearing term. It's a term of derision. Simply put, this was used as evidence that Jesus was not the Messiah to call him Jesus the Nazarene. Herod never intended to fulfill prophecy when he sent his troops down to slaughter the children. People of Jesus' day never intended to honor him as Messiah by calling him Jesus the Nazarene, although the Old Testament prophets had predicted it. People fall asleep at the wheel of current events and fail to miss the importance of the gospel message, just like the scribes and the Pharisees did when Jesus was born in Bethlehem. They never even bothered to get up and go look. Peter tells us in 2 Peter chapter 3 that at the end times, people will mock us, mock believers, and say, where is the end of the world? Where is his coming? Because everything has continued on as it has from the beginning. You talk about Jesus returning to earth and making things right. Well, when's that going to happen? Because if it's delayed, what do? We deny it. And there are 4 Christmas promises after all the presents are opened and after all the meals have been consumed and you settle down into the post-Christmas lull. There are 4 prophecies that you absolutely need to weld into your heart and into your mind. And every last one of them, 4 of those prophecies simply confirm one thing. God keeps his word. That's why I can pick up the book of Revelation and say, it may not happen in my lifetime, but it's going to happen. It's going to happen. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your grace to us. And welded inside the Christmas story are 4 promises from you that come to fruition in the birth of your Son in a manger, in a feeding trough. We live in a world that looks for the next new thing and misses the old. We live in a world that's hurrying to find the next thing and misses the answer from eternity past. We live in a world that wants the next quick fix for our human dilemmas and misses the answer that's been provided by the only source that can take care of our greatest human need, and that is the sin in our hearts. There's no better gift that we could ever give at any time, at any point in the calendar year, than sharing the good news that Jesus Christ came and died for our sin, was crucified, raised the 3rd day, ascended into heaven, and is coming back, because God keeps his word. Thank you, Lord, for the timelessness of Christmas. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. I'll be here afterwards if you have questions, you want to talk or pray. Thank you for coming, and I'll see you next year.